welcome, and thank you so much for coming. Hopefully you'll find some interesting things today. So the title of my talk is Pathogens, Prions, and Protozoans. So I'm going to talk about some of the different things about microbes, give you a little bit of basic biology. We'll talk about prions and the difference between those and viruses and bacteria, vaccines, secondary infections, protozoans, fungi, and just really, to me, really interesting stuff. And this actually came from somebody that suggested they were asking about what prions were and stuff, and I thought, well, this would make a really good, interesting talk because maybe not a lot of people know. So, without further ado, here is about 4 weeks of biology on one slide. So, biology in a nutshell, and the reason why I'm going over this is because if we look at the difference between viruses and bacteria, and prions, it almost comes down to these 4 kind of basic components. So first is the nucleic acids, and you'll see that in living things and even in non-living things like viruses, there's only 2 different kinds of nucleic acids that we know, and today I have my little handy-dandy pointer to show you. You can see the DNA has 2 strands, so it looks like a ladder, and RNA has 1 strand. Both of these carry the information on how to make an organism, depending on what that organism is. So for humans, we have DNA, and you can think of it almost like an instruction manual. It has the blueprints for how to make you. Okay, and then DNA gets copied to RNA, and then that becomes proteins and all kinds of other stuff. But the thing I want you to notice from this is you notice that the DNA structure is much more solid than the RNA structure. That's like the big thing you want to notice here, okay? And that it carries instructions for how to make stuff. The reason why is because DNA is far more stable than RNA is, and that's going to be an important thing when we talk about viruses in a little bit. Okay, now, that's the instructions. Proteins are our building blocks for those instructions, and proteins come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and functions. So if you imagine a building, your DNA is the blueprint on how to create the building. The proteins are everything that makes the building. Everything. The metal, the cement, the wood, the plaster, down to the electrical wires, the windows, all kinds of things. So if you think about it in that sense, there's a huge variety of proteins. Your body is basically made out of these proteins, okay? Now, the 2 things that we're not going to talk so much about, but they are important, are carbohydrates. You guys know carbohydrates, sugars, starches, all of those things. Primarily like quick, short energy in a way. You know how they say like in the morning you should have a complex breakfast with complex carbohydrates like bagels and things like that. Those are your carbohydrates. And then you've got your lipids, which is the fats and the oils. I'm not going to talk too much about the carbohydrates and the lipids. I am going to talk far more about the proteins and the nucleic acids. Okay? So, any quick questions, not discussion, but just clarifying questions that I can answer for you there? And if you can type them in local chat, that would probably be better. But if not, you can just say, I've got a question and go onto the microphone if you need to. Any questions? Yes. Clint, that is a picture of a protein folding. And in fact, I chose this picture in particular, and thank you for actually bringing that up, because proteins have various structures, and they kind of change in a level of complexity. So really, if you think about proteins, and it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around it a little bit, at least I think it is, all proteins are kind of like little wads of like wire that is shaped to do all kinds of just incredible stuff. I mean, if you think about like how life is built upon protein function, it's kind of mind-blowing. But they all start with this kind of string of amino acids. These are just like beads of amino acids, but the amino acids have like certain properties that make a protein behave the way it does. If you imagine amino acids are like beads, magnetic beads in a string, you wad them together, they form different shapes. Okay, and so there's the simpler shapes, which you can see are the spirals, and then these are called beta-pleated sheets. Okay, and then you squish those up and scrunch them up, and now you've got these tertiary structures. And then when you take a bunch of these tertiary structures, a bunch of these proteins, and put them all together, you get more complex structures like enzymes and other things. And yeah, I could do a whole lecture about all of this, but I don't want to. Not tonight, anyways. But yes, this is actually important when we start talking about prions. Thank you, Clint, for reminding me about that, is proteins have particular structures, and the way that they're scrunched up like this at the end here really determines what that protein is going to do. So we talk about form and function when we talk about proteins. So thank you. Are there other questions that I can answer for anybody? Or shall I go on? Can I go on? Alrighty, thank you, Vadi. Thanks, guys. Alright, so prions. Everybody hears about prions. I'm sure a lot of people maybe have remembered mad cow disease. This was a huge thing in 1994 and 1995. Really big, really scary, because at that point, like, people were really actually afraid to eat beef, even though when those cases happened, these mad cow disease cases happened, the infection actually occurred 10 years before. So when people were dying of mad cow disease in 1994 and 1995. 1995, you can see there were over 14,562 cases in the UK alone. Over 1,000 people came down with mad cow disease almost every week between 1994 and 1995. They were actually infected by an infected cow 10 years ago, meaning they ate infected beef in 1984, 1985, approximately, which is probably the reason why people were really terrified. That means between that time, you know, you could have had infected beef and nobody would have known. There's a whole really interesting story about prions, and and Stephen's going to like wince at this, but he's actually going to read the book about prions by Prusner, who was the scientist that discovered them. Because before that, nobody believed that a disease could be caused by a protein. Everybody thought that the smallest pathogen there was actually a virus. So when Prusner said it was proteins, it was really, really hard to believe, because the interesting thing is the difference between a prion protein, and I'm really watering this down, okay? So just to let you know, those of you that are prion experts, please don't, tell me, I know it's more complicated than this, but here's the essential idea. We all have proteins that are called prion proteins. I know it's a little confusing, but yes, these are normal proteins in our brains, and they serve a particular function. Okay, but the problem with these prion, this mad cow disease, is that this paperclip, if you will, changes its conformation, its structure, into something else. And when that happens, it no longer functions the way it's supposed to. The problem is our brain is full of prion proteins. All of our cells have these. And the scary thing about prion disease is that it's a slow conversion of all these regularly shaped proteins. They're actually called alpha helices. That's the shape, into these beta-pleated sheets. That's what happens. And actually, I will talk about this a little bit more in detail here. But yes, it is just a protein that's been warped into a different shape. And they're not alive. These are purely proteins. So here's the example of this. So if we look in our brains, for instance, and proteins are really tiny, okay? And back then, quite incredible that Prisoner was able to discover this, because the technology behind understanding protein shape was not as good as now. So he did this based on a lot of different experiments and things like that. But let's imagine in our brains that our proteins kind of look like this, okay? This swooshy thing. Now, what ends up happening is, for some reason, say you ate, contaminated meat, you've ingested a different kind of prion protein. It's made of the same thing. It's like a paperclip, except its conformation looks really different, as you can tell. Okay? Now, the problem with these conformations, and this is the disturbing thing, is that when they run into a normal protein, a normal prion protein, so you see here the distinction is that there is this regular prion, PRP, and the other form, and forgive me, I will admit this, I forget what the SC stands for. Maybe Stephen remembers, but prion protein SC means it's the mutated form. When they touch each other, it starts a reaction, and for some reason when they touch each other, it folds the normal protein into a prion protein. Isn't that freakish? Like, this is so scary. Right? So every protein, it's almost like a chain reaction, like a domino effect. So you have one domino knocking down another domino. Now you've got two. Those two dominoes now hit other prion proteins and convert those over too. So over the course of 10 years, the reason why it's actually called a prion protein, a spongy form prion protein, is because your brain literally becomes a sponge, because these structural proteins, prion proteins, no longer can hold their structure anymore. So this is the reason why, and some people ask, well, how did this happen? Back during that epidemic, 1995, in Europe and I believe in the United States too, there was this habit that cattle people had, livestock, where they would take the remains of cows, like you would take the meat and the stuff that you don't eat, the bones and all of this stuff, brain, nerves, which is where the prion protein resides, gets crunched up into a meal and fed back to the cows. So this is, literally like Soylent Green for cows, okay? And what ended up happening then is, doing that over and over again, the cows got these diseases, but yet people didn't realize that they could actually pass to humans. So now there is a lot of regulations. There's a couple actual regulations put in place to make sure this doesn't happen in the United States. For one, and you can go back and look at some of the research, you can Google it, they talk about how they incinerated so many cows because of this. And actually another really scary thing about prions, which is like terrifying, is that you can't kill them. So bleach normally doesn't work. Also, things like irradiation doesn't work either. So these are like almost, for some reason, when this prion protein conforms into this shape, it becomes like far more hardy. You can barely destroy it. So yeah, it's kind of a scary thing. So anyways, what is also interesting about this shape, okay, is that there are prion forms in almost all mammals. And humans, there is a form, they talk about kuru, which is, again, it's a prion type of disease that was in a tribe where cannibals would eat the remains of their infected loved ones. And before you judge, this is not one of those, cannibals that would like hunt down a bunch of people and eat their meat. This was cannibalism of when somebody died, they would eat their loved one's remains, because that was a way of letting them live on in, other people. So anyways, what ended up happening though is that when people died from prions, they would eat the remains and obviously get sick, and it would continue to pass on. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here. I believe it's pronounced Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Affects 1 in 100,000 people every year. And this is actually a mutation. It's genetic. Thank you. Million. Thank you. 1 in a million people each year. This is actually genetic. And what ends up happening is the people that have this prion protein have a single mutation, a single base that has changed, a single amino acid that has changed in their protein. And the scary thing is, because of that, it will, for some reason, spontaneously fold into this, PRPSC conformation. And when that happens, well, the person is pretty much dead. This does run in families, which is interesting. And occasionally they do, obviously turn up. Is there any way to prevent Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease? No. Is there any cure for prions? No, because it's a protein. The scary thing is when this happens, when this turns up, people freak out because obviously you can't kill it, and it becomes a big problem. You incinerate the cows and bury the ashes very, very deeply into the ground with the hope that nobody gets contaminated with it. So yeah, any questions so far on prions that I can answer for you? Do we know if the errors in proteins is tertiary or quaternary? And also, does heat or acid-based denaturing make the bad protein safe? As far as I understand, Clint, denaturing does not make the protein safe. In fact, my understanding is that it's a nearly, and Stephen, you can weigh in on this if you want, it's a nearly like, I don't know, I'd almost say an immortal type of protein. It's very unusual. You really can't destroy it, which is, it's freakishly scary that it's a matter of conformation. And the errors in the proteins, I believe it's a tertiary structure because it's an alpha sheet that gets folded into a beta sheet. So in fact, it's actually a secondary structure. It just spontaneously bends out of shape into this thing. Let's see. Fadi, you had a question. Did you want to voice it? Or did you want to type it? Okay. Is this shape a more stable shape for proteins that they naturally revert into if no resistance is given, like how water assumes the shape of a bubble? I don't know. I can say when it does go into this, alternate conformation, it is far, far more stable than what naturally exists. So hopefully that answers your question there. Usually it doesn't spontaneously convert. You actually need to have another prion protein there in order for that conversion to happen. However, if somebody has a mutation, this Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, they have a higher chance of it just spontaneously changing shape. Let's see, Rune, you said, can the immune system fight it? No, because that protein is you. So it doesn't fight it. You can't really do anything about it because it's not viewed as a foreign thing. Chronic wasting disease is also a prion disease. I don't know. I don't think so, but that's only because the prion disease is actually a brain. Like, for instance, sheep get this too. It's called scrapie. And in scrapie, when sheep get this disease, they actually will rub against a fence pole until they rub all the way down to the bone sometimes. They're just no longer conscious. Cows, there is a regulation that says if a cow cannot walk up the ramp on its own, it cannot be used in our food system. So that's one of the ways they actually eliminate potential cows that have prion disease from our food source. Did I get everybody's question? I'm sorry. Let's see. I got Vadi's, I got Runes, chronic wasting. Oh, Madison, you had one. And Star. Oh, thank you, Star, for reposting that. Chronic wasting disease is also a prion disease. Okay. Caliban looked it up. Thank you. So according to CDC, chronic wasting disease is a prion disease that affects North American cervids, hoofed ruminant mammals with males characteristically having antlers. There you go. Yes, Vadi, please. I would love for you to pronounce the name. I would like that.
Okay. It is pronounced Kreutzfeldt.
Kreutzfeldt?
That is how it's pronounced. Kreutzfeldt.
Thank you so much. I would have never known. I really appreciate that. Kreutzfeldt. So Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you. Deer and elk, yeah. Thanks. Okay, are there other questions about prions? I'm going to go on to viruses next, so if there's any questions about prions, ask them now. No? All right, I'm going to go on. So I'm closing down the local chat. All right. Viruses. Okay, viruses are also not alive. What's interesting is prions are made of that one protein, right? It's really scary, freakish protein. I actually, when I read about prions, it terrifies me. Viruses are like DNA or RNA, and you can see, let me grab my pointer here, at the very top. They either have DNA or RNA, a nucleic acid, surrounded by a protein. Now, as you can see, they come in really different shapes. And like I said, you can imagine, I always describe viruses kind of like a Tootsie Roll Pop. So you have the chewy chocolate center in the middle, which is the nucleic acid, and then you have the really tasty protein coat on the outside. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes it's the protein coat that actually helps a virus infect cells. So, and you can see here, this is an RNA virus, which is tobacco mosaic virus. This is a DNA virus. This is adenovirus. You've got influenza, which is the one that causes colds. And then I'm sorry, not colds, geez, and that causes flu. And then you've got a bacterial phage, which is a virus of bacteria. Each one looks very different because remember what I said before, proteins come in very, very different shapes and structures. So you can see, and these are, multiple different kinds of proteins that make up the structure. And yeah, they're just, think of them as very deadly killing machines. This is how I would describe them. They're just quite incredible little buggers. And they're quite tiny. You cannot see them under the microscope. Most of them you cannot see under the microscope. You actually have to use, and you can see adenovirus, influenza, and bacteriophage, special electron microscopy in order to see these guys. Let's see. Some examples that you may have heard of: flu, dengue, which is passed by mosquitoes, yellow fever, also passed by mosquitoes, Ebola, which I talked about a few weeks ago, certain colds, Norwalk virus actually has been on the news lately, and rotavirus, which is a favorite in daycare centers. Bioterrorism has thought about using smallpox, so sometimes you'll hear about that, and viral encephalitis. Okay, so about viruses. They're very different from prions. So remember, prions is basically, a healthy prion bumps into an unhealthy prion, and all of a sudden, boom, they change shape, and then they go and infect other ones. Now, here, viruses take over very differently. What they do, for the most part, and I have to say this is a very general diagram to give you an idea of how viruses infect because they are different than the other pathogens. Viruses infect by standing on a cell. So notice that a virus, okay, so pretend this is like your cell. It's very big, right? Virus, very small. It's like a hypodermic needle. The protein stands on the outside and it injects its DNA or RNA into the cell, okay? Now, what ends up happening is that nucleic acid comes and it basically replaces, not so much replace, but it takes over the nucleic acid that is already in the cell. So think of it this way, is say, for instance, your body is a construction warehouse, and you have the blueprints for how to make you, right, sitting in the middle of the table. A virus basically has picked the lock to go into your warehouse, takes the book, replaces it with its own. Now, your cells are dumb. They don't know this. So what they end up doing is, instead of constructing proteins, pieces to make you, they start instead making pieces of virus. They're basically now virus machines. And what they do is now they create more and more and more virus, so much so that the cell bursts, it dies obviously, and releases all of these viruses into your body to infect other cells, other lucky cells. Okay, so this is the basic cycle. But the one takeaway that I want you to have about viruses is that their nucleic acid is what's doing this, is going into the cell. The cell now makes the virus itself, commandeers the virus, okay, the virus commandeers the cell to make viral parts for it, and then in the making of the viral part, it basically kills the cell, bursts, and it's done. Okay, so questions. How does the human body fight a virus? Great question, Truth, and that's probably the thing for another talk. But we have an entire immune system, cells and all kinds of things that will do this. But one thing I will say is that the human body does have a few defaults. So for instance, do you see in part C where the cell is actually making viruses? Cells are built with almost like this automatic system for when it gets infected, it will, and even when it doesn't, it frequently displays pieces of its protein on its surface, on its cell surface. So if I use my pointer here, you can see the surface of the cell, this outer part, which is the cell membrane. It will display it on the outside. Okay, and the reason why it does that is because there's other cells, cytotoxic T cells, for instance, that will come and kind of touch the top of the cell, and those proteins should be right, quote unquote right, meaning they should be my proteins, right? Body proteins. But as soon as it sees that it's a foreign protein, well, then all sorts of things start to happen. So I'll just start it with that, and then, leave that as a teaser for an immune system talk a little bit later. Other questions that people have about this? Any clarifying questions that I can answer for you? Or let me know if I can go on. Okay, I'm going on. Oh, yes. You mentioned that viruses aren't alive. That's a great question, Vadi. What is the scientific definition of life? Love it. I would argue it's a very arbitrary definition. If it's made out of cells, it's alive. If it's not made out of cells, it's not alive. Yeah, it must be a cell. So this goes back to what's called cell theory. All living things are made out of cells. And all cells, yeah, exactly. All living things are made out of cells. So because viruses are not made out of cells, they're defined as being not alive. And again, this is kind of an arbitrary thing. I think it's one of those things where biologists says, well, we have to define life somehow, so let's just define it here. But as you can see, what we define as non-living is not exactly right, because look at all the really scary things these things can do. Rune is saying here, I imagine those that are capable of self-replicating on their own rather than using a host could be. It could be, but then again, you actually have, and most recently, in fact, there's scientific evidence that nucleic acids, DNA itself, can be replicating, which is really fascinating stuff. Do viruses metabolize? No, they do not. They actually, Caliban, need to have a host in order to replicate. They have to have a living cell in order to replicate. Otherwise, they're actually just nothing. They're just this protein with DNA. Let's see, Vadi says metabolism is accomplished through cells. Exactly right. Let's see, Madison says something virus was once a cell at some time. Yes, and in fact what's interesting is in some cases when viruses pop out of cells, their protein coat is actually partially made out of cell membrane, which is again kind of gory if you think about it. It's just basically saying, oh, thank you very much, cell. I'm just going to take all of you and goodbye, and I'm going to infect other things. Yes, Madison, you're talking about retroviruses. One thing, remember I talked about how DNA is very different from RNA. The reason why that's kind of important is that viruses that are have RNA have a tendency to mutate. So